In 2015, 60-year-old Margaret Collins was discovered lifeless in her Boston apartment. Beside her was a haunting note that read, "Victor deceived me." What seemed, at first, to be the sorrowful end of a lonely widow's life soon transformed into a complex tale of international fraud. It involved a sham marriage, millions of dollars stolen, and a calculated scheme that preyed on her vulnerabilities. 3 years later, authorities apprehended the man behind it all. Yet the search for answers and justice had only begun. Margaret Collins was a 60-year-old widow from Boston, Massachusetts, cherished in her neighborhood for her kindness and quiet demeanor. After losing her husband Charles 5 years earlier, Margaret's once vibrant life had slowed significantly. Her grown children lived out of state, and her grandchildren's visits had become less frequent over the years. She spent her days gardening in her small backyard, volunteering at the local library, and baking pies for her neighbors. Yet beneath her calm and gentle exterior lay a deep and unshakable loneliness. When she found herself alone in a room, she would frantically grab every piece of furniture before she left to meet Piper. It was this loneliness that led Margaret to explore online dating, a step she took cautiously and with little expectation. She joined a site catering to seniors seeking companionship, crafting a modest profile that reflected her simplicity. It highlighted her love for gardening, her knack for baking, and her enthusiasm for visiting new places. While Margaret wasn't looking for a whirlwind romance, the thought of having someone to share her days with brought a small but meaningful spark of hope. This glimmer of hope turned brighter when she came across Victor Abayomi. His profile depicted him as a polished and successful businessman based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Victor introduced himself as a charismatic entrepreneur running a flourishing export company. His first message to Margaret was respectful and charming, setting the stage for what became weeks of heartfelt correspondence. Victor shared vivid stories of his upbringing, work, and aspirations, all of which captivated Margaret. His warm and seemingly genuine interest in her life, her family, hobbies, and late husband brought a joy she hadn't felt in years. Margaret found herself rejuvenated by her connection with Victor. After years of solitude, she began to feel a spark of happiness return to her life. Her friends and family noticed her renewed optimism. She seemed lighter and more engaged, often speaking of the thoughtful and kind man she had met online. Though some of her friends expressed concern about Victor's sincerity, Margaret brushed aside their doubts. He had been open about his upbringing, the challenges he faced, and his dreams for the future, dreams that now included her. By January, Victor suggested they take the next step and meet in person. He invited Margaret to Johannesburg, promising to show her the vibrant culture of his home city and introduce her to his family. Initially, Margaret was hesitant. It had been years since she had traveled, and the idea of a long journey to another continent felt intimidating. But Victor's reassurances, combined with her longing for companionship, overcame her fears. With growing excitement, Margaret booked a flight to Johannesburg and informed her children of her plans. Her son voiced concerns about the risks of meeting someone she had only interacted with online, but Margaret remained steadfast. She saw this as a chance for a fresh start and refused to let apprehension hold her back. In February, Margaret boarded her flight, carrying with her not only a suitcase but also the hope of finding love once more. She couldn't have known that this journey would thrust her into a meticulously crafted scheme of deception, shattering her trust and exposing the dark reality of the man she thought she knew. Margaret Collins arrived in Johannesburg, South Africa, with a mix of anticipation and nervous excitement. As she stepped off the plane, she was immediately immersed in the bustling energy of the city. The vivid colors of street vendors, the hum of traffic, and the warmth of the tropical air overwhelmed her senses. Margaret felt a sense of adventure she hadn't experienced in years, all driven by the hope of meeting Victor Abayomi, the man who had reignited her zest for life. True to his word, Victor was waiting for her at the airport, impeccably dressed and wearing a wide, welcoming smile. Investigators would later reconstruct her arrival through airport surveillance footage and travel logs. Victor's charisma was magnetic, and he knew how to win Margaret's trust. He greeted her with a bouquet of fresh roses, a gesture that seemed thoughtful and genuine, but was later revealed as part of his elaborate ploy. Over the next few days, Margaret was enveloped in an outpouring of affection and hospitality. Victor introduced her to people he claimed were his close family and friends, each of whom embraced her warmly. Unbeknownst to Margaret, these individuals were actors complicit in Victor's scheme, playing their roles to perfection by praising his generosity and making her feel like she had found a place in a close-knit, loving community. Victor spared no effort to maintain his facade of success. Investigators uncovered records of extravagant dinners at some of Johannesburg's finest restaurants and private tours of local landmarks. He showed Margaret what he claimed was his export business headquarters, a meticulously staged office space meant to exude legitimacy. Within weeks, Victor surprised Margaret with a proposal of marriage. He portrayed it as an impulsive yet heartfelt act of love, one that left her overcome with emotion. Margaret believed she was embarking on a beautiful new chapter, unaware that her trust was being manipulated as part of a carefully calculated plan. The wedding took place in what Victor assured Margaret was a legitimate courthouse. Photos from the event captured Margaret in an understated but elegant dress, radiating joy. Standing beside her, Victor wrapped his arm around her shoulders, exuding pride. Margaret believed she was surrounded by Victor's family and closest friends, all there to celebrate their union. In reality, every aspect of the ceremony was a sham. The courthouse was a rented space, the officiant was a hired actor, and the guests were accomplices hired to pretend. Even the marriage certificate Margaret signed was a counterfeit. Margaret left the ceremony filled with hope and confidence in her new beginning. She believed she had entered a loving partnership and eagerly embraced her future with Victor. Shortly after the wedding, Victor began discussing a potential joint business venture. He described it as a highly profitable opportunity that would guarantee their financial stability for years to come. Completely committed to her new life, Margaret was eager to contribute and support her husband. When she returned to Boston, she carried keepsakes from the wedding, a fake marriage certificate, joyful photographs, and the belief that she had found love and purpose once more. Unbeknownst to her, she had already become ensnared in an intricate web of deceit. Victor soon introduced what he called a promising investment opportunity. Investigators would later uncover a series of emails in which he outlined vague but enticing details of a lucrative real estate development in South Africa. He assured Margaret the project was near completion and only required additional funding to succeed. With unwavering trust in Victor, Margaret began transferring money to the South African bank account he provided. The initial amounts were modest, but these small transactions marked the start of her financial downfall. As Victor's demands grew increasingly bold, Margaret found herself faced with the difficult decision of depleting a significant portion of her savings to fund his business venture. She sold stocks from her retirement portfolio and liquidated a long-standing investment account. Her bank flagged one large transaction for its unusual size, but Margaret reassured them that it was for her husband's business and dismissed their concerns. Over the course of 2 months, Margaret transferred $3.5 million. Victor fortified her trust by sending convincing photos of construction sites and legal-looking documents that appeared to validate his claims. However, investigators later found that these images were either generic stock photos or manipulated documents produced by Victor's network of accomplices. Despite the financial toll, Margaret's sacrifice began to weigh heavily on her. Her family and friends started to notice a change in her. The bright and happy woman they had once known was replaced by someone weighed down by anxiety and uncertainty. Margaret confided in her longtime friend Emma that Victor had been less communicative since her return to Boston. His once constant calls had become infrequent and curt. Yet Margaret clung to the hope that his silence was due to the pressures of finalizing their business venture. By the 3rd month, Victor had all but vanished. His phone was no longer in service, and the email address he had used to communicate bounced back every time Margaret sent a message. The once charming man who had promised her a new life had disappeared without a trace. Margaret's initial feelings of unease quickly turned into panic. She reached out to the South African contacts she had met during her visit, only to find that their phone numbers no longer worked. She contacted the South African consulate in Boston for help, but the absence of a valid marriage certificate complicated the situation. What Margaret had believed to be a legitimate marriage was, in reality, nothing more than an elaborate lie. In a state of desperation, Margaret hired a private investigator, the investigator quickly confirmed her worst fears. The courthouse where she had been married was a rented venue. The officiant was a hired actor, and the friends and family she had met in Johannesburg were all strangers paid to pretend. Victor Abayomi, it turned out, was a false identity, and the bank accounts to which she had transferred money were either closed or traced to fictitious names. Margaret's world collapsed. In less than 6 months, she had lost her entire savings and her trust in people. The betrayal consumed her, pushing her into an overwhelming depression. Her family, unaware of the full extent of the scam, chalked up her withdrawal to the pain of a broken heart. They encouraged her to focus on moving forward and rebuilding her life, but Margaret saw no way out. Her descent into despair culminated in a heartbreaking moment when, one quiet evening, her son discovered her lifeless body. Beside her was an empty bottle of pills and a note that simply read, "Victor deceived me." The discovery of Margaret's death marked the beginning of an investigation that not only revealed her tragic story, but also uncovered a widespread network of scams preying on vulnerable individuals across the world. The news of Margaret Collins's death reverberated through her family and community. Her son Thomas, who had found her, was haunted by the note she had left behind. "Victor deceived me." Thomas had no idea who Victor was, or the depth of his mother's involvement with him, but he was determined to learn the truth. He handed the note, along with Margaret's phone and personal documents, to the authorities, hoping they could uncover the full story. Months stretched into years as the investigation continued, but Victor remained elusive. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind no verifiable identity or location. Detective Miller and her team kept tracking international databases, hoping for any signs of his activity, but Victor never resurfaced. For Miller, the case became a poignant reminder of the devastating human cost of fraud. Margaret wasn't merely a victim of financial crime. She had been manipulated emotionally and psychologically, leading to her tragic demise. 3 years later, Miller received an unexpected call from the FBI, who had flagged an individual entering the United States. The name on the passport was a new alias, but the description matched Victor Abayomi. He had been using a different identity, but was trying to meet another potential victim in Miami, a wealthy widow who had unknowingly been in contact with him for months. Miller immediately collaborated with the FBI, sharing everything her team had uncovered about Victor. A sting operation was quickly organized, and when Victor arrived at a luxury hotel in Miami to meet his latest target, he was arrested. His devices were seized, revealing an extensive history of scams, with evidence that directly connected him to Margaret's case. When news of Victor's arrest reached Thomas, he felt a complex sense of relief. Justice was within reach, but it couldn't bring his mother back. The subsequent trial exposed the full scale of Victor's fraudulent network, which had preyed on vulnerable individuals in multiple countries. The staged wedding, the forged documents, and the false persona he had created were all tools of an emotional predator. Margaret's tragic story became a powerful symbol for those advocating against online scams. For Detective Miller, the case underscored the persistence required to seek justice, even when it seemed impossible. If you enjoyed this dive into the mystery, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime OCS for more chilling stories from history's darkest corners. Drop your thoughts, theories, and questions in the comments below. Let's untangle the truth together. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.